Oh, sì, we have one. Somebody is coming in. Okay. Salve, salve tutti. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, and I hope you've been enjoying the conference. I am the Moderatore of this session, which is Misto di Lingua. I want to introduce to my left Antonella Veroso and Fred Gardolfi and Alberto Stramaccione. Before we begin, I just want to share with you an experience I had recently. To prepare for this, I watched some Italian films, and I'm sure you're all familiar with La Notte di San Lorenzo, wonderful film. And in that film, you know the story, people are fleeing from the Germans who are retreating and hoping to be rescued by the Allied forces. One of the characters in the movie says, "While I'm waiting for the Sicilians to rescue us." Another character says, "What do you mean, the Sicilians?" The answer is, "The Sicilians from Brooklyn." Well, the good news is, we've arrived. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Where's this? Oh, you. Okay. What?
You introduced it.
I did. Yes. First speaker is Alberto Stramaccione.
Allora, innanzitutto buonasera a tutti e devo ringraziare tutti voi che siete a quest'ora presenti, perché avete tutti appena mangiato e quindi cercheremo di non appesantire questa relazione, e ringrazio il professor Ruggero, Ranieri e la professoressa Valoroso perché hanno contribuito all'organizzazione e mi hanno anche invitato. Quindi ora questa tematica, le relazioni tra Italia e America nella Prima Guerra Mondiale, è una tematica che ci si è occupati poco o pochissimo in Italia, parlo lentamente, poco o pochissimo in Italia, quindi 5 minuti in più, poco o pochissimo in Italia e ancora meno negli Stati Uniti. Ho fatto una piccola ricerca sull'insegnamento della storia sulla Prima Guerra Mondiale nelle scuole di livello più basso dei primi anni in America, e non appare mai l'insegnamento che riguarda la storia della Prima Guerra Mondiale, nemmeno nei livelli universitari. Solo rarissime ho visto istituzioni di studi storici negli Stati Uniti si occupano della Prima Guerra Mondiale. C'è stato ci sono state le celebrazioni del 150° anniversario in Italia, in America sono usciti 2 o 3 volumi di consultazioni bibliografiche, però niente di nuovi studi, in Italia quasi la stessa cosa. Allora io ritengo che invece ricostruire le dinamiche attraverso le quali si è arrivati alla Prima Guerra Mondiale e poi le relazioni che ci sono state tra l'Italia e gli Stati Uniti sia importante per capire bene o abbastanza bene la storia del Novecento e la storia delle relazioni italo-americane, perché qualche storico ha detto che il XX secolo è iniziato nel 1914 e è finito nel 1989. Qui le interpretazioni possono essere varie e tante. Adesso su questo non ci soffermiamo perché non è l'argomento della sera, ma che è iniziato sicuramente nel 1914, questo è fuori discussione. Ora, le relazioni italo-americane fino ad allora diciamo che erano molto legate a relazioni tra istituzioni bancarie e forse una serie di intellettuali e corrispondenti informazioni giornalistiche, ma per esempio non c'era un autorevole ambasciatore americano in Italia, perché Page è il primo ambasciatore nominato da Wilson nel 1912 o 13, prima c'erano i consoli se non sbaglio, un console a Roma, quindi non c'era nemmeno una relazione diplomatica istituzionale, ufficiale, consistente. Dopo magari la Valoroso, che conosce meglio le cose, mi dirà che non è così, però almeno queste sono le mie informazioni. Ora, perché è importante affrontare questa tematica, almeno dal mio punto di vista? Perché per la prima volta innanzitutto si costruiscono le relazioni diplomatiche abbastanza intense. Per la prima volta un presidente degli Stati Uniti d'America viene in Italia, viene in Europa, ma anche in Italia. Per la prima volta, diciamo, si manifesta un interesse politico per il sistema politico americano, quindi nasce una specie di corrente di pensiero che apprezza il sistema politico americano in quanto liberale riformatore o liberal progressista. Ci sono anche alcuni, diciamo, uomini politici italiani, poi vedremo, che hanno una particolare attenzione o interesse per il sistema politico americano. E secondo qualche studioso nasce un po' anche, o comincia a nascere, il mito americano in Italia. Ora io affronterò 4 tematiche più, diciamo così, dettagliate per vedere quali sono state queste relazioni italo-americane. La prima tematica riguarderà la politica estera americana e il superamento dell'isolazionismo, della dottrina Monroe e quindi dell'intervento diretto in un conflitto armato, perché prima del 1917 l'esercito americano era intervenuto, ma nel Messico, in piccole guerre, e prima della guerra c'era la Guardia Nazionale Repubblicana di 40.000 circa militari, quindi non c'era un esercito degli Stati Uniti, e questa non è una cosa, diciamo così, di poco conto. Poi la seconda tematica è il ruolo dell'Italia durante la guerra e la propaganda all'estero che ha fatto l'Italia per convincere gli americani che in fondo le ragioni dell'intervento italiano in guerra erano ragioni sostenibili. Poi vedremo che Wilson si comporterà come si comporterà. In terzo luogo, l'intervento, diciamo, di solidarietà, di sostegno, soprattutto assistenziale e sanitario, di personaggi e figure, iniziative della Croce Rossa americana in Italia, più che un intervento militare dell'esercito americano, perché sul fronte italiano l'intervento americano non c'è stato. Poi dirò come c'è stato: è morto un caporale, poi diremo anche il nome in onore alla memoria di questo caporale, ma non c'è stato un vero e proprio intervento militare. E poi la questione che secondo me può essere più interessante è la presenza di Wilson alla conferenza di pace del 1919 e questo atteggiamento di Wilson, che sulla base del suo idealismo o del suo progressismo o dei suoi 14 punti praticamente prima è una specie di eroe per gli italiani, una volta che dice non si può rispettare il patto di Londra perché è vecchio e usurato, diventa una specie di demonio per gli italiani. Allora, queste sono le 4 cose e Ruggero, soprattutto non ti preoccupare, farò rapidamente, 5, 6, 7 minuti per ogni punto. Primo punto: c'è una singolare coincidenza tra il neutralismo italiano e il neutralismo americano nel 14, perché come sapete la guerra inizia nel 14, tra il giugno, luglio e agosto. In poche settimane mezza Europa è in conflitto. Ci sono ancora gli storici oggi che vogliono spiegarsi perché è stato possibile che in 3 settimane gli stati europei sono entrati in guerra e nessuno è stato in grado di bloccare l'intervento, e secondo me ci sarà da studiare ancora per i prossimi decenni. Però comunque sia, l'Italia è neutrale, gli Stati Uniti d'America sono neutrali. Sono 2 neutralità naturalmente molto diverse, adesso vedremo, però comunque anche se Theodore Roosevelt era un interventista, un progressista interventista e un repubblicano che sarebbe voluto intervenire dappertutto, io ricordo da giovane che c'era una sua frase che diceva: state silenziosi, andate in giro con un grosso bastone e sarete vincenti. Oppure diceva: noi americani siamo così lontani dagli europei, ma non vi illudete che la nostra sicurezza non è garantita dall'Oceano Atlantico. Quindi era un personaggio, come tutti voi sapete meglio di me, che aveva determinate caratteristiche, carattere, personalità forte, uno dei, diciamo così, dei più importanti presidenti americani, ma con queste caratteristiche. E di fronte al neutralismo di Wilson, che è stato eletto nel 1912, di fronte al neutralismo di Wilson c'è questa pressione dei repubblicani americani per entrare in guerra. Però Wilson è, come sapete, come molti accademici di un tempo, non di oggi, ha un suo idealismo in politica estera abbastanza rigoroso, per cui dice: questa guerra che è scoppiata in Europa è una cosa che a noi non ci riguarda, perché sono le vecchie monarchie europee che litigano tra loro. Noi siamo gli Stati Uniti d'America, siamo una repubblica, siamo nati sulla lotta contro il colonialismo europeo e ce ne stiamo a casa nostra tranquilli. Ora, naturalmente, questa sua posizione poteva reggere non molto, anche se è una posizione che ha retto per 2 anni, 2 anni e mezzo. E Wilson fece un discorso nel 1914, il 19 agosto del 14, e disse che la posizione di neutralità degli Stati Uniti d'America non era poi così, diciamo, difficile da sostenere, perché diceva: noi siamo comunque l'arsenale della democrazia europea e della democrazia nel mondo, quindi siamo noi che sosteniamo il fronte franco-britannico e russo, anche se con la Russia il rapporto era certamente di un altro tipo. Però disse sostanzialmente che avrebbe sostenuto l'America, lo sforzo di queste nazioni, Francia e Gran Bretagna in particolare, e 3 banche, tra le più importanti banche americane del periodo, la Morgan, la Citibank, la National Citibank e la New York Bank, avevano e stavano finanziando, se i dati, leggo bene i dati, addirittura l'85% delle ordinazioni militari francesi e inglesi. Quindi il sostegno comunque non militare ma finanziario e per certi versi politico da parte degli Stati Uniti c'era. E nel periodo in cui gli Stati Uniti d'America non sono entrati in guerra a fianco di inglesi e britannici, sono aumentate le esportazioni in maniera consistentissima, si è passati da 6 a 800 milioni di dollari, naturalmente per esplosivi, prodotti chimici, ferro, acciaio e poi per la importazione di carne, grano, eccetera, eccetera. Quindi l'atteggiamento era, diciamo così, di neutralità, ma di sostegno, quantomeno finanziario e commerciale. Ora però inizia la guerra e a guerra iniziata il conflitto tra tedeschi e austriaci e ottomani da una parte e francesi e inglesi e russi dall'altra diventa un conflitto molto impegnativo e dispendioso per tutti e 2 i fronti, ma anche per il fronte belga e per il fronte francese e inglese. E naturalmente la marina militare tedesca cercava di bloccare i rifornimenti tra gli Stati Uniti d'America e la Gran Bretagna, e non raramente c'erano questi sommergibili tedeschi che affondavano le navi americane che trasportavano viveri e anche persone dall'Atlantico all'Europa. E ci fu questo famoso, diciamo non famoso ma significativo affondamento della Lusitania, di questa grossa nave dove morirono qualche centinaio di americani, ma poi ci fu un affondamento anche di altre navi mercantili, commerciali. E quindi già nell'opinione pubblica americana il clima era in una parte significativa di neutralismo, ma allo stesso tempo anche di intervenire in qualche modo. Ci fu questa sottovalutazione, per esempio, anche da parte di molti storici, che il cosiddetto telegramma Zimmermann, di cui si parla poco nei libri di storia, però fu un fatto che scatenò l'intervento, poi contribuì a scatenare l'intervento americano. Questo telegramma Zimmermann era il telegramma che venne dall'intelligence britannica, venne intercettato, era il ministro degli esteri tedesco che praticamente scriveva a messicani o anche a personalità dell'establishment americano di intervenire per far entrare il Messico in guerra contro gli Stati Uniti d'America. E in quel momento tra il Messico e gli Stati Uniti d'America c'era un conflitto per il Texas, per alcuni stati del sud. Quindi forse venne colta l'occasione del telegramma Zimmermann, ma comunque forse era anche matura la decisione negli Stati Uniti di intervenire in qualche modo. E Wilson fece questo intervento il 2 aprile del 17 al Congresso e chiese al Congresso l'autorizzazione per la dichiarazione di guerra alla Germania e solo alla Germania, perché riteneva Wilson e i suoi consiglieri che l'Austria-Ungheria potesse essere separata dalla Germania e dagli interessi della Germania. Quindi il 7 aprile dichiarò guerra solo alla Germania e qui fece un discorso che adesso non ho tempo, ma insomma un discorso che sottolineava il suo idealismo in qualche modo e diceva che la nostra guerra è una guerra per la pace sostanzialmente, che oggi possono suonare molto attuali questi tipo di valutazioni, ma possono essere anche considerate molto discutibili naturalmente. La guerra per la pace è un concetto abbastanza controverso, diciamo così. Quindi con questa dichiarazione di guerra praticamente nasce quello che è stato chiamato il complesso militare industriale americano, forse l'hanno chiamato gli studiosi o gli storici marxisti complesso militare industriale per voler criticare un po', avere un po' di anti-americanismo, non lo sappiamo questo, ce lo dirà qualcuno più avanti. Comunque sia, c'è questo grosso investimento in pochissimi tempi da parte del governo americano che sottrae potere ai governi federali naturalmente e quindi decide in pochi mesi, con i Liberty Bond e con altre iniziative, decide in pochi mesi di costruire un esercito quasi da zero. E addirittura si arriva ad avere una quantità sterminata per il periodo tantissimi di sottomarini, navi, mercantili, 16.000 aerei, alla fine della guerra 4 milioni di militari e in Europa ne vengono inviati quasi 2 milioni. Quindi rendetevi conto che tra il 1915 diciamo e il 1917 si arriva a una situazione di questo genere dove si impegna una parte consistente del bilancio americano che poi diventerà una specie di investimento che avrà la sua forza e espressività in tutto il Novecento, perché poi questa struttura militare, industriale avrà un peso, come sapete bene, nella seconda guerra mondiale. Quindi viene creata un corpo di spedizione in Europa, cominciano le navi ad attraversare l'Atlantico a portare armi militari e soldati e qui mi piace sottolineare che ci sono, sì, il comandante Pershing, che tutti voi americani conoscerete, ma ci sono 4 giovani colonnelli, uno si chiama Douglas MacArthur, uno si chiama George Patton, uno si chiama Harry Truman e un altro si chiama George Marshall. Quindi questi 4 colonnelli, uno diventa segretario di Stato dopo la seconda guerra mondiale, Marshall, Truman diventa presidente degli Stati Uniti e Patton e MacArthur sono i 2 grandi generali che voi conoscete nella seconda guerra mondiale. Quindi c'è anche una nuova generazione di militari e sono quelli che Pershing magari aveva già fatto esperienza, il generale Pershing, nelle guerre precedenti tra fine 800 e i primi 900, però comunque sia c'è questa nuova leva di questi 4, dico solo questi 4 perché ce ne sono naturalmente anche altri poi stati. Quindi che cosa succede? Che questa spedizione militare arriva in Europa, prima negli Stati Uniti, ci sono dei resoconti di questo arrivo di questi soldati di colore a Parigi e la gente era addirittura spaventata, li vedeva per la prima volta perché siamo nel 1917 naturalmente. E Wilson, mentre i soldati arrivano in Europa, fa questo famoso discorso che tutti voi sicuramente conoscete, quello sui 14 punti nell'8 gennaio del 18, in cui tra le tante cose dice: qui finita la guerra ci vuole una pace che rispetti il diritto all'autodeterminazione dei popoli, che è una teoria e una linea di politica estera che va contro le logiche imperiali e va quindi contro le logiche imperiali dominanti in Europa nell'Ottocento e nel Novecento. E però questi famosi 14 punti, se li guardiamo diciamo così con l'affidabilità dei politici di oggi, uno li ha detti 14 punti, poi se li dimentica o non li vuole attuare, mentre invece va detto che c'è una rigorosa attenzione all'applicazione delle norme che lui stesso ha definito, che sarà in contrasto con i repubblicani quando torna in America, e in questi 14 punti c'è anche la creazione della Società delle Nazioni che non riuscirà a farla approvare dal Congresso, quindi una cosa, anche una sconfitta abbastanza pesante anche per Wilson. Comunque andiamo avanti e la guerra continua, i soldati americani arrivano in Europa e dobbiamo dire che c'è subito, questo va detto, una certa diffidenza dei francesi e degli inglesi nell'utilizzare la forza militare americana, perché li ritenevano quasi impreparati o inadeguati a fare la guerra, perché gli stati maggiori britannici e francesi i primi mesi hanno messo i centinaia di migliaia di soldati americani a fare le strade, i ponti, sistemare le divise, fare lavori come hanno fatto gli anglo-americani con gli italiani nel 1943, a cucire le divise, a mettere i bottoni, poco più. Quindi all'inizio Pershing chiedeva agli stati maggiori inglesi e francesi di combattere, ma non li facevano combattere, e erano tanti, perché ritenevano che gli serviva la forza militare e la manodopera, tra virgolette, ma se loro fossero massicciamente intervenuti avrebbero tolto la gloria, diciamo così, all'esercito francese e a quello britannico. Quindi ci fu per mesi e mesi una specie, diciamo così, di conflitto e di ostilità comunque, perché se noi guardiamo la storia così romanzata è una cosa, invece questo fu un problema abbastanza serio per tutto il 1917, almeno quasi fino alla fine dell'anno. Ora però vengono in Europa e qual è l'atteggiamento dell'Italia? Ora l'Italia, come sapete, è entrata in guerra nel maggio del 15, cioè un anno dopo che la guerra era scoppiata, perché per un anno l'Italia parlava con gli austriaci e parlava con gli inglesi e i francesi e naturalmente chiedeva di avere dei vantaggi dalla sua entrata in guerra, o a fianco dei francesi e degli inglesi o a fianco dei tedeschi e degli austriaci. Adesso non vorrei insistere su questo mercanteggiamento perché daremmo un'immagine dell'Italia abbastanza negativa, però va detto che la realtà dei fatti è che Sonnino e Salandra, Sonnino ministro degli esteri e Salandra capo del governo, con l'accordo del re Vittorio Emanuele III, hanno fatto queste trattative e avevano firmato a Londra questo patto, il cosiddetto patto di Londra, in cui era scritto che se l'Italia si schierava a fianco di francesi e britannici, alla fine della guerra, una volta risultato il fronte vincitore, in cambio c'era il Trentino Alto Adige, il Friuli Venezia Giulia, l'Istria, la Dalmazia, non Fiume, vedremo perché dopo. Quindi, lo vedrà Wilson, io non l'ho visto, l'ha visto lui. Quindi a un certo punto l'Italia entra in guerra e naturalmente deve coltivare anche i rapporti con gli alleati, perché naturalmente l'Italia non era conosciuta se non per gli immigrati negli Stati Uniti d'America e per cose meno, diciamo così, e l'ambasciatore, qui c'è una breve dichiarazione che penso giustamente di leggere di 3 righe, l'ambasciatore Page, che era arrivato già da 4 anni in Italia, dice: c'è un mare di ignoranza e di incomprensione tra gli italiani e gli Stati Uniti d'America. e soprattutto c'è una mancanza di conoscenza dei progressi compiuti dal giovane regno, il Regno d'Italia, nel suo primo cinquantennio di vita, e poi aggravato questa incomprensione e mancata conoscenza da un diffuso senso di insofferenza e di rifiuto verso le masse di migranti in arrivo dalla penisola. Questo è il giudizio dell'ambasciatore americano, quindi è un giudizio benevolo verso gli italiani, ma comunque che mette in evidenza questa distanza, questa mancanza di conoscenza, diciamo. E l'ambasciatore qui diventerà un personaggio famoso, quello che vi sto dicendo adesso. Devo fare più rapido? Più lento? Più lento. Mezz'ora? Allora, allora, cancelliamo tutto il resto, però questo personaggio lo devo dire perché l'ambasciatore italiano a Washington, Vincenzo Macchi di Cellere, è un ambasciatore abbastanza particolare che riteneva di essere più importante di ministri, di capi di governo, eccetera, eccetera. Quindi quando è arrivata, adesso la facciamo rapidissimamente, quando è arrivata una commissione italiana negli Stati Uniti d'America tra il maggio e il giugno del 1917, lui si preoccupava che questi ministri, che tra l'altro c'era anche il cugino del re, quindi non c'erano solo, c'era Nitti che era stato ministro, che poi sarà capo del governo, si preoccupava che questi non dessero una brutta immagine dell'Italia, per cui cercava di educarli, di portarli di qua, di là, di sotto, di sopra. Comunque ci fu questa commissione, andiamo velocissimi, ha visitato questa commissione italiana negli Stati Uniti d'America, ha visitato molte città americane, Atlanta, New Orleans, Memphis, Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, Boston, Filadelfia, ha incontrato Wilson, ha incontrato tantissimi ministri, banchieri, imprenditori, ha avuto molti rapporti, Lansing che era il segretario di Stato, e questa missione ha contribuito, adesso non vi dico i nomi di tutti i personaggi, ha contribuito in maniera abbastanza, io ritengo, utile, perché i giornali americani hanno dato una grandissima pubblicità a questo viaggio, e si è arrivati ad una situazione in cui, veniamo alle ultime parti se no, a una situazione in cui poi, finita la guerra, con la vittoria del fronte italo-franco-britannico-americano, Wilson viene in Italia, va a Londra, a Parigi naturalmente per la conferenza, e poi viene in Italia, e venendo in Italia naturalmente è accolto dal 1° al 4 gennaio del 17, ha accolto, visita Milano, Roma, Genova, incontra il Papa, come tutti fanno. 19, che cosa ho detto io? 1° gennaio 19, no certo, finita la guerra, no, durante la conferenza, l'avvio della conferenza, e quindi ha una accoglienza straordinaria, perfino Mussolini, ancora non il Mussolini che conosciamo, direttore del popolo, lo considera quasi un eroe, perché l'autodeterminazione dei popoli, il principio che lui aveva professato, pensava che poteva essere utile all'Italia, perché disse una frase che era nello stile mussoliniano, che bisogna rispettare i diritti degli italiani, ce lo chiedono 460.000 morti. A quel tempo ancora i morti erano 460.000 per l'Italia, poi saranno 700.000, però intanto lui si è avvantaggiato nel tempo. E quindi questo tipo, diciamo così, di accoglienza contrasta molto con quello che Wilson fa poi durante la conferenza di pace. Allora, questo patto di Londra, vi ho detto quello che rappresentava, quello che c'era scritto, e Wilson che fa? Praticamente fa un gesto che francamente fu abbastanza riprovevole a quel tempo da parte degli italiani, ma insomma un gesto che una certa diplomazia, lui era per la New Diplomacy, no? E fece un gesto che era poco diplomatico, perché essendo contrario a prendere in considerazione il patto di Londra, fa una dichiarazione che pubblica su un giornale francese, quindi nemmeno pubblica su un giornale italiano, e dice che è inutile che Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, Sonnino, gli italiani chiedono il rispetto del patto di Londra, oramai è superato e tanto più non devono chiedere Fiume, perché è un porto che deve essere in qualche modo legato alle attività commerciali di serbi, croati e sloveni, perché il criterio secondo lui dell'autodeterminazione dei popoli significava questo, rispettare anche le esigenze del nuovo regno jugoslavo che nel frattempo si era creato tra serbi, croati e sloveni. Quindi c'è una reazione, e chiudo qui, però devo dire che durante il viaggio lui ha citato Mazzini, ha citato Garibaldi, perché la cultura politica di Wilson era un po' legata anche alla cultura politica mazziniana. Comunque sia, poi una volta che lui ha sostenuto queste posizioni, naturalmente c'è una fortissima reazione in Italia, c'è D'Annunzio, c'è l'occupazione di Fiume, ci sono delle conseguenze che poi porteranno alla salita al potere del fascismo, perché una delle cause della cosiddetta vittoria mutilata portò poi a una reazione popolare e militare e fu uno delle micce, diciamo così, che accesero una rivolta politica, sociale, che poi condusse all'ascesa del fascismo. Concludo. Comunque sia, ci siamo nei 35 minuti, comunque sia, questa, diciamo così, relazione italo-americana durante la guerra ha innescato una serie di relazioni e di rapporti che poi sono continuati e per certi versi si sono intensificati anche durante il fascismo. E poi naturalmente tutti sappiamo il ruolo che hanno svolto gli Stati Uniti d'America nella seconda guerra mondiale, ma questa è un'altra storia. È a posto? Sarai contento?
Ci sono domande? Any questions?
Più che una domanda, una curiosità. Più che una domanda, una curiosità. Ricordo di aver letto nelle ricerche che facevo per quanto riguarda l'insegnamento dell'italiano negli anni 20 e 30 negli Stati Uniti, che proprio su alcuni libri di testo si parlava proprio del debito che gli italiani avevano nei confronti degli Stati Uniti durante la Prima Guerra Mondiale, il debito di guerra proprio. E uno dei motivi per cui Mussolini ha cercato di tenere buoni rapporti con gli Stati Uniti era il fatto che l'Italia aveva un grosso debito di guerra nei confronti degli Stati Uniti. Addirittura è stato utilizzato proprio per la propaganda questa cosa, abbiamo pagato i nostri debiti di guerra in tempo, e questo ci ha messo, almeno io leggendo appunto, era utilizzato dalla propaganda proprio per dire noi rispettiamo i patti, abbiamo pagato il debito di guerra fino al 35, no? Poi il 35 la guerra d'Etiopia, succede un casino e cambia completamente l'atteggiamento nei confronti dell'Italia. Ora mi chiedevo appunto questo aspetto qui, no? Il fatto che c'era un intervento degli Stati Uniti non solamente a livello proprio di guerra, ma proprio anche inizia lì in un certo senso una relazione un po' di dipendenza nei confronti degli Stati Uniti da parte dell'Italia. Però ecco, lo vedo da non storico chiaramente, però mi incuriosiva questo aspetto, che proprio nella propaganda fascista si sottolinea molto questo fatto che gli italiani avevano saldato il loro debito di guerra nei confronti degli Stati Uniti.
Allora, il tempo è stato quello che è stato, io ne avevo messo negli appunti, però addirittura i governi italiani hanno fatto 5 rate negli anni per ripagare i debiti agli Stati Uniti, quindi 5 rate, perché adesso non ricordo bene la cifra, ma è un debito di milioni di dollari, quindi consistentissimo, e si è portato dietro appunto fino agli anni 30, e però forse da quello che io conosco era un debito più con alcune banche che avevano garantito acquisti da parte di aziende americane che si erano impegnate nei rifornimenti e nelle cose, quindi era un debito, diciamo, indiretto con il governo era attraverso queste 3-4 banche che poi erano consistenti. Però questo, oggi si potrebbe leggere questa cosa come, perché a quei tempi i fascisti italiani non erano anti-americani come lo sono stati poi negli anni 60-70 del Novecento e oggi, oggi no, scusate, oggi no, però a quel tempo erano, diciamo così, non filoamericani, perché, come voi sapete meglio di me, avevano un rapporto buono con la Gran Bretagna, perché comunque era sempre il grande impero britannico con il quale avere buoni rapporti. Avevano un rapporto così con alti e bassi con la Francia, ma con gli Stati Uniti d'America è un rapporto soprattutto con le banche americane e soprattutto poi per l'importazione di petrolio o di altri materiali che durante il ventennio sono serviti all'industria italiana. Quindi non erano anti-americani, bisognerebbe dirlo a questi giovani oggi che comandano in Italia. Questa è un'altra storia. Ma è perché io ho solo le prime 5 pagine, perché questo dittatore qui davanti a me mi ha impedito qualunque cosa, difatti lui è americano un po', quindi allora si chiama la Merita Red Cross, si chiama, lo guardiamo, si chiama, perché è morto solo lui, quindi allora, sì, lui, no, è proprio durante l'assalto a Vittorio Veneto. Il 332esimo reggimento americano è andato a passeggio praticamente nella zona, perché già la battaglia di Vittorio Veneto era finita. No, adesso già che ci siamo, a parte i Fiorello e gli Hemingway, qui c'è il tenente Whit Coleman, medaglia d'oro italiana al valor militare alla memoria, perché era un istruttore dell'aeronautica italiana. Poi c'è Alexander Craig e James Ball, che caddero vittima nel corso di uno scontro con l'aeronautica austriaca durante le fasi conclusive. Poi il tenente Clarence Young è il solo pilota statunitense da bombardamento costretto ad atterrare oltre le linee nemiche. E adesso troviamo il caporale, perché siccome alla storia è passato un grande caporale, adesso caporale boemo lo troverò, c'è Charles Kell. Sul tagliamento di Casarza morì il caporale Charles Kell.
Dunque, io volevo dire solo una cosa. Quando si parla dei rapporti del fascismo con gli Stati Uniti, ora, è vero che per molti anni ci fu un rapporto molto positivo, tutti gli anni 20 e anche una buona parte degli anni 30. Poi con la guerra di Etiopia l'opinione pubblica americana comincia a distaccarsi anche, ecco. Però poi dall'altra parte però i circoli dirigenti, quindi l'amministrazione, i circoli finanziari, insomma ancora guardano con un po' di benevolenza l'Italia, e questo si vede fino al 40, quando ci sono le ultime missioni di Summer Wells in Italia. Quindi c'è ancora un fatto, un'attenzione, no? Adesso non entro nei dettagli, però dall'altra parte anche il fascismo comincia a essere molto più ostile, cioè nel 1938 c'è quella campagna, non so se del Ministero della Cultura, di Gaida, che copriva di insulti la dirigenza americana, non so se le cose che dicevano di Roosevelt, forse le conoscete, io non mi ricordo, è addirittura volgare quello che dicono. Quindi i buoni rapporti a un certo punto finiscono non solo da parte americana, dove tra l'altro c'è secondo me maggiore benevolenza, ma da parte italiana c'è un inasprimento, una volgarizzazione dei rapporti che è molto grave, insomma, è molto significativa, e comincia direi nel 37 ma soprattutto nel 38 e poi da lì poi si va alla guerra, quindi no, per mettere a fuoco, se no sembra che anche noi alla fine il fascismo è stato ostile negli ultimi anni, ha fatto quella svolta filo hitleriana, revisionista nel modo più violento, quindi questo lo volevo dire perché sennò passava un'idea che su cui non sono d'accordo.
No, vi dico solo una piccola cosa, che per dar ragione a Ruggero, perché così è meglio per tutti noi, tra il 26 e il 39 ben 1000 studenti americani sono stati all'Università per Stranieri di Perugia. Quindi vuol dire che i rapporti, anche se c'era l'ambasciatore Child mussoliniano o c'era qualcun altro, dopo magari, però quasi 1000 studenti americani a Perugia non era una cosa di poco. Ce n'erano 3000 tedeschi, ma questo è normale, 2800.
Grazie, grazie.
Prego.
Sì, grazie a tutti. E grazie professore.
Quindi posso andare?
Ok. No, lei...
Sì, facciamo uno switch.
Sì.
I just go. I introduce myself, we'll jump right there. So, slides in Italian and talk in English. And the title of my talk is Uguccione Sorbello's teaching experiences in the 1930s between Yale University and Middlebury Italian Summer School. Here we go. So, in spring 1931, Uguccione Sorbello leaves Italy and moves to the United States, where he will spend the following 6 years. He was 25, and by that time he had already graduated in law at the University of Rome, and he had also been a student at the Faculty of Political Science at the Royal Fascist University of Perugia. Why did he leave? On the one hand, he certainly wanted to escape the career in law and administration his father Ruggero had planned for him. On the other, he wanted to explore the possibility to build for himself a different career as a teacher and writer. The goal of my presentation today is to have a closer look at Sorbello's teaching activity between 1931 and 1937. An activity which took place at Yale University Italian Department and at the Italian Summer School of Middlebury College. This will inevitably lead me to also have a look at the context in which this activity took place. Very soon, Sorbello will in fact widen the network of his interests and contacts, and his path will intertwine with that of relevant personalities and institutions. Thanks to a few documents I recently retrieved at the Yale archive, we know that Uguccione Sorbello was admitted as a student to the graduate school of Yale University, where he enrolled in the academic year 1931-32. Before the retrieval of these documents, we believe that he had been just hired as a lecturer. Now we know that he really wanted to pursue a different kind of career. And he had the intention of seeking a PhD degree in Romance languages. After years spent studying subjects he wasn't really interested in, he probably felt the need to receive a more formal training in literature and humanities. We don't know if he had also applied to other schools. He certainly collected general info about American colleges and universities, since some of these documents are present in his archive papers here in Perugia. Yeah, landowner, the father. The father. That's the occupation of the father. On a form he completed on April 20, 1931, right after his arrival at Yale, as you can see in the slide, there was a very specific question: for what career do you want preparation? And his answer was teaching career. The photo you see in the slide is also the original one included in his personal file at Yale. It is interesting to notice how the arrival, I just want to grab the mic and feel more free already. So the arrival of Sorbello in the Yale community had already been announced 2 days earlier on the Yale Daily News, where one can read that, and I'm quoting from the Yale Daily News, the course Italian 31, a survey of Italian literature, a course covering Italian literature from Dante, Boccaccio and Petrarch through the Rinascimento and the Risorgimento to the present century, end of quote, will be given during the coming year by Dr. Di Sorbello, a graduate of the University of Rome. A week later, on May 15, he was already lecturing at the Circolo Italiano of New Haven. As you can see in the slide showing the invitation card to the conference, he gave a talk about letteratura italiana di guerra, Italian war literature. New Haven's Circolo Italiano had been founded around 1920 and modeled after the Circolo Italiano of Boston that had been founded in 1901. Knowledge of Italian was required since the monthly readings and lectures were delivered in Italian. The early 1930s were crucial years in the history of Yale University. Despite the Great Depression, between 1929 and 1934, the university expanded both physically and culturally. In April 1931, the Sterling Memorial Library was completed, and in fall 1933, after 3 years of construction, the first 7 residential colleges were also opened, bringing about an entirely new university culture. Since the appointment of Professor Angelo Lipari as associate professor and head of the department in 1924, the Yale Italian department had also been constantly growing. A year before Lipari's arrival, in 1923, the students taking Italian were 36. And a Yale Italian Society, a club of students interested in the Italian language and culture, had just started its activity, sponsoring lectures on Italian literature and giving a play in Italian every spring. 10 years later, in 1933, the number of students had doubled, including both undergraduate and graduate students. In fall 1931, Uguccione Ranieri di Sorbello joined a teaching team which already included Professor Lipari and Archibald Thomas McAllister, a PhD candidate who had started teaching the year before, right after completing his undergraduate work at Yale, and later he'll be a professor at Brown and Princeton University. As said before, during the academic year 1931-32, Sorbello had to teach the course Survey of Italian Literature, a course covering Italian literature basically from Dante to Carducci. It was certainly not an easy task for someone with no background in teaching, especially if one considers that he was at the same time taking classes 3 per semester as a graduate student, a workload which probably proved more challenging than he expected. From a certificate issued on June 1st, 1932, we can see that he regularly attended and completed his first year of graduate work, and his grades were all excellent. In the academic year 32-33, the following year, his teaching load increased. He had to teach again the Survey of Italian Literature course plus an advanced Italian class, in which he introduced an interesting innovation. Rather than meeting his students 3 times per week, he had 2 regular classes and then met each student separately for further practice in composition and conversation. As a graduate student, he kept taking 3 classes per term, in English mostly and French literature, and he still managed to get excellent grades, except in the English literature class. However, most of the professors he worked with during his second year highlighted in their comments both Sorbello's undeniable qualities and his lack of discipline and accuracy. The quality of his teaching work, on the other hand, must have been pretty good, because in spring 1933 he got a promotion for the following academic year from the rank of assistant in Italian to that of instructor. In the fall of 1933, there is a significant change in Sorbello's experience at Yale, since he decides to temporarily leave graduate school. On the form he fills on October 2nd, he writes, and I quote, "I intend for several months to dedicate myself to the compiling of a book," end of quote. In reality, he'll never resume and never complete his work as a graduate student. He will never get his PhD, but he'll remain at Yale for 2 more academic years, teaching and taking active part in many cultural initiatives on campus, and soon broadening the range of his interest and activity well beyond Yale. In 1934-35 and in the following year, he keeps teaching the advanced Italian course, and instead of the Survey of Italian Literature course, which he probably didn't like teaching, he starts teaching a course on modern Italian writers, a topic certainly closer to his personal interests. The class was conducted chiefly in Italian, but not exclusively in Italian, and the readings included works by Carducci, Verga, Pascoli, D'Annunzio, Fogazzaro, Croce, Marinetti, Papini, Pirandello, Borgese, and others. And class lectures focused, I quote from the course description, on the development of the literature of modern Italy and its significance in European thought, end of quote. This is how the 2 courses were reviewed by Yale undergraduates on the Yale Daily News in April 1934. And I quote, "Advanced Italian furnishes excellent intensive training for those who wish to master the language. Reading is combined with frequent themes and original speeches. Mr. Di Sorbello carefully polishes the grammar. Modern Italian writers entails much reading and scarcely any writing. Interesting lectures by Mr. De Sorbello give a valuable insight into the material considered, but there is relatively little opportunity for student discussion," end of quote. The academic year 1933-34 marked a high point in the relationship between the Italian government and Yale University. During the previous 5 years, Yale had exchanged students with a number of Italian universities, including Rome, Florence, and Pavia. In 1933, the Italian Ministry of Education had awarded Professor Lipari a gold medal for special merit in education, and in 1934, Yale received a gift of about 300 books by the Italian government. The collection donated by the Italian government included the 120 volumes of the Classici Utet, works by the most important writers of the 19th and 20th century, from Pellico to Pirandello, a number of writings of an historical, critical, and artistic character, an example being the 6 volumes of I Maggiori, edited by Giuseppe Prezzolini, and a special group of books presenting the theory, aims, and accomplishments of the fascist regime. Yale was not the only American university to receive such a gift from the Italian government. In a letter dated November 22, 1934, Piero Parini, direttore generale degli italiani all'estero e delle scuole, a division of the Italian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, informed Giuseppe Prezzolini that 9 American colleges and universities, including Yale, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Princeton, and the University of California, had already received a collection of about 250 volumes. And I quote, "Abbiamo anche incaricato la Reale Ambasciata di interessare le università perché queste biblioteche vengano collocate in una sala o locale separato, che potrebbe così costituire anche un centro di riunione del circolo italiano delle singole università, il quale, potendo contare su una sede stabile, sarà in grado di svolgere la sua attività con maggiore efficacia e regolarità." End of quote. That's exactly what happened at Yale. where the new Sala Italiana, located in Sabre College and decorated in the style of the Italian Renaissance, opened in February 1934 and became the center for the activities of the Yale Italian Society. An article published on the Yale Daily News in February to announce its inauguration also specified that the new Sala, and I quote, will cooperate with local and national organizations interested in Italian arts and letters, these including the Circolo Italiano of New Haven, the Casa Italiana of Columbia University, and the Italy-America Society, end of quote. Sorbello had certainly a very active role in the initiatives of the Yale Italian Society and Sala Italiana, and this probably helped him to widen his network of contacts outside the university. As a matter of fact, he had already cooperated, or would have soon worked with, all of the above-mentioned organizations. He had been lecturing at the Circolo Italiano of New Haven since his arrival in town. In 1934, he had started publishing articles on the Giornalino edited by Giuseppe Prezzolini, the director of the Casa Italiana, and by 1935, he'll be working for the Italy-America Society. The academic year 33-34 did not only mark a high point in the relationship between the Italian government and Yale University, but it was probably also the most rewarding of the years spent at Yale by Sorbello. Free of the burden of graduate school duties, he had finally been able to turn to writing, complete a rather original one-act play in Italian, and see it successfully staged by the Yale students on May 3rd, 1934. In the slide, you can see the program where it's clearly stated that the play is presented by the Yale Italian Society under the auspices of the Sala Italiana. You can also notice that Sorbello uses the pseudonym Ugo Ollebros. The tradition of staging a play in Italian every spring had been going on since the creation of the Yale Italian Society in 1923, but Sorbello's one-act play, Con le signore c'è più gusto, was something new. The text had not only been expressly written to be performed by Yale students, but it also included 2 Yale undergrads among its characters. The funny comedy revolves around the incidents that occur when 2 Yaleys, Gordon and Joy, who are spending the summer in Italy at the Forlani Villa on Lake Como, decide to help Isolina, the daughter of their host family, to attract the attention of a potential suitor. After learning with surprise from Isolina that, in Italy, married women usually have more suitors than single ones, one of the 2 American students pretends to be her husband to see if that is really the case. From here, a chain of funny events is set into motion, which will culminate in a surprise ending. According to the review published on the Yale Daily News on May 4th, the performance was a success, and I quote, "Those who could not understand the Italian easily followed the plot, and those who could were rewarded with witty and sparkling dialogue. If this is the author's first attempt, it should be encouraged by the ovation which he received and bashfully refused to accept at his comedy's premiere." End of quote. A few weeks later, at the end of June 1934, Sorbello also starts teaching at the Italian Summer School of Middlebury College. The Casa Italiana of Middlebury College had been opened only 2 years earlier, in 1932, joining the already existing French and Spanish schools and adopting their successful teaching method. The school was directed by Gabriella Bosano, chair of the Italian department at Wellesley College. The Middlebury method was based on, and quoting from the 1934 Language School Bulletin, segregation of students from those using any other language, exclusive use of Italian in classroom and dormitory, concentration of all phases of the student's life upon the mastery of Italian, instruction in small groups by native teachers. End of quote. Beginners, in fact, would not be accepted. It is not clear how Sorbello got to Middlebury. However, it is interesting to note that at the beginning of that same year, 1934, both Sorbello and Bosano published articles in Prezzolini's Giornalino. So, Prezzolini might be the culprit. It is in Middlebury, stimulated by the vibrant atmosphere of the Italian summer school, that Sorbello teaches his most interesting courses, some of which designed by himself. In the summer of 1934, he teaches 2 courses, Modern Italy in Word and Thought, and Advanced Composition and Practice in Style. Let's have a look at their description in the Middlebury Language School Bulletin. Modern Italy in Word and Thought is a reading course in some of the outstanding writers from the opening of the century to the present, consisting of lectures on the various Italian literary movements and schools that have held the limelight in these past years, and on their relations to European thought and to cultural and political developments in Italy. Students were urged to bring with them any important book written since the 1900s. Advanced Composition and Practice in Style was an advanced course for students possessing a thorough knowledge of Italian. It consisted of translations from English into Italian of texts of increasing difficulty, writing of original Italian composition, and practice in the formation of a personal style through the study of passages from a few of the leading Italian writers of today, back then, with special composition exercises aimed at assimilating their different ways and expression. Students will also study, with reference to grammar and syntax, Italian phrasing, idioms, synonyms and antonyms, similes, proverbs, etc. For the translation exercises, Sorbello interestingly used an anthology presenting the plots of well-known novels such as David Copperfield by Charles Dickens and Captain Courageous by Rudyard Kipling. As you can see in the slide, its title was 100 Words Best Novels Condensed. The idea of working on the formation of a personal style is also noteworthy. We'll see how, throughout his experience at Middlebury, Sorbello will show specific interest in this particular field. And I'll go back to this in a little while. In fall 1934, he returns to Yale, where he keeps his position as instructor for the academic year, teaching the same courses he had taught the year before, Modern Italian Writers and Advanced Italian. He's again involved actively in the organization of the annual Italian play sponsored by the Yale Italian Society, a performance of Goldoni's Locandiera that will be staged at New Haven Little Theatre on March 4, 1935. For the occasion, as one can read on the Yale Daily News, the title role was performed by a Wellesley College student, Mr. Rita Hopkins, who had already successfully played the role in a summer performance at Middlebury. A few days after the performance, on March the 8th, Uguccione writes a long letter to his brother Lodovico, in which, among many other things, he says, and I quote, "L'altra sera abbiamo dato qua la locandiera. È stato un gran successo, ma anche una gran fatica per gli ultimi 2 mesi. Anche dal punto di vista finanziario abbiamo fatto quattrini per la Yale Italian Society. Abbiamo fatto venire una ragazza da Wellesley, una vera artista per la parte. Basta. Ora è finita se Dio vuole. Sono contento di aver saputo tirare in porto questa faccenda bene prima di lasciare il nostro dipartimentuccio." End of quote. Sorbello had in fact just been informed that his appointment at Yale would not have been renovated for the following year, and he was subsequently full of doubts about his future. Ti basti... Oh, probably no. I don't want to do. I skipped too quickly. Okay, yeah. Ti basti sapere, he writes to his brother, l'ultimo sviluppo della situazione di cui ha avuto comunicazione ieri. L'università, in seguito al suo nuovo deficit d'esercizio di $300.000, continua, come per i passati 2 anni, un certo licenziamento di istruttori. Tra questi ci sono anch'io. Furthermore, the bad news came at a time when his relationship with his father Ruggero was particularly strained, and the latter had just deprived him of any form of financial support. Ruggero had also made it very clear that, in case Uguccione had decided to return to Italy, he shouldn't have expected help in finding a job or hospitality in his parents' home. In the March 8 letter, Uguccione reflects deeply on his current situation, and his mood is certainly not optimistic. Da oltre 4 anni lontano dalla patria, in mezzo a gente estranea e spesso ostile, lavorando per un salario che a paragone di quello che ricevono altri che lavorano meno di me è irrisorio, ma che oggi con la prospettiva del niente comincia a sembrarmi qualche cosa. Sulle soglie del mio 30° anno il bilancio della mia vita è poco buono dal punto di vista finanziario e pratico, senza una posizione, senza un quattrino. Quando penso che il 10 agosto ritirerò il mio ultimo minutissimo paycheck, mi viene un brividuccio. Neppure la prospettiva di rivedere l'Italia, che prima mi allargava il cuore, riesce più a farmelo passare. The only certainty he had at that moment was in fact the teaching job at Middlebury for the summer. In the summer of 1935, he teaches again the course Advanced Composition in Practice and Style, and he also teaches a new course, The Balance Between Classicism and Romanticism in 19th Century. According to the course description, again in the Middlebury Bulletin, the latter was a lecture and reading course on the outstanding Italian writers and thinkers of the last century, the 19th century. It would have offered an outline of the clashes and truces between classical tradition and the Romantic creeds, and would have explored the writings of Foscolo, Monti, Manzoni, Leopardi, and then Carducci, Verga, up to D'Annunzian, as he calls it, the new D'Annunzian super-romantic idea of the man of art. The daily program at Middlebury was intense for both students and faculties. 3 evenings a week there were social gatherings. On Mondays, reading or acting of Italian plays by teachers and students together. On Wednesdays, the faculty gave lectures with slides on contemporary Italy. On Saturday, teachers and students enjoyed Italian games, songs, and music. On Sunday and Thursdays, in the evening, the students of the Italian school were free to accept the invitation of the French school to attend the concerts of French chamber music and other entertainments. On several Friday evenings, there were also general dancing at the gymnasium. In 1935, there even was a Renaissance costume party, and you can see the picture in the slide. Uguccione will go back to teach at Middlebury one last time in the summer of 1936. Meanwhile, a few important changes had occurred in his life. He had strengthened the already existing ties with the Italy-America Society and had become managing editor of the quarterly Italy-America Review, a position he will keep until his return to Italy. His play, Con le signore c'è più gusto, had been published by New York Italian publishers, the publishing house owned by Andrea Ragusa, a key figure in the cultural network of New York. But let's go back to Middlebury, where in the summer of 36, Sorbello teaches again the course on the balance between classicism and romanticism in the 19th century, and he also presents a brand new course, the craft of writing in its various uses, described in the Middlebury Bulletin as, and I quote, a finishing course in composition and style for the most advanced students. Every week a special field of writing will be chosen for careful study, thus translation, letter writing, editing flat or redundant prose, anecdotal or biographical write-ups, dialogue, journalistic reporting, etc. will in turn be discussed. Students will also cooperate in the writing of a short play, end of quote. In a sense, Sorbello had poured all of his past and most recent experiences and interests into his new course. That summer, he also directed the production of the one-act play Il Poeta by Dario Nicodemi, while Michele Cantarella directed the production of La Giara by Pirandello. Sorbello was supposed to go back to teach at Middlebury in the summer of 37, and he had even prepared a new course on Italian lyric poetry, a course focused on the study of the development of Italian lyric poetry from Giuseppe Parini to the outstanding poets of the 20th century. In this course, in addition to lectures by the professor, part of the class time would have been devoted to practical exercises in diction and to a study of the expressive and musical reading of Italian poetry. Unfortunately, he'll never have a chance to teach such an interesting class. He will instead go back to Italy in the first months of 1937, where he'll start working for the newly created Ministry of Popular Culture. His teaching experiences had ended for good, and a new crucial season in his life was about to start. However, the summer spent at Middlebury left a strong mark on him. He will be considered a constant friend to the school, and when he returned to the United States in the 1950s as cultural attaché to the American Embassy, he went back to Middlebury for the alumni meeting in 1954 and gave a lecture on D'Annunzio. He was again of great help to the Middlebury School in the 1960s when arrangements were being made to start a graduate school in Florence. As far as Yale is concerned, I have not found any evidence of further visits of him. In conclusion, I would argue that the teaching experiences of the 1930s, both at Yale and Middlebury, definitely marked a significant stage in Sorbello's intellectual and personal development. The Middlebury philosophy, in particular, with its emphasis on the crucial role of creativity and the importance of active engagement in any learning and communication process, left, in my opinion, a significant imprint on his lifelong work as writer, lecturer, journalist, and promoter of Italian language and culture. Thank you. You want to hold it?
I have to, no, I'm not. Well,
We could have one question session since we're both talking about Sorbello, maybe, yeah, so that will, yeah.
See if I can find mine. It's right.
Yeah, ask. Yeah. Okay, aspetta. No.
Putin is invading my talk. Oh. Not enough for the Ukraine. Yeah, there's the president. But, no? Putin's still in.
No, it's not. There you go.
Okay, perfect.
He's trying to, but...
All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to just tell you about this long talk I've done. We are moving 30 years ahead from where we were in Yale in the life of Uguccione, Ranieri di Sorbello. When I was first introduced to the writings of Uguccione and Ranieri di Sorbello, I was impressed by the sheer amount he had accumulated during his career, both in Italian and in English. As I began reading, I realized what he did best, what he did consistently throughout his writings, was to present a synthesis of the work of others that was accessible to his audience. And after this talk, I realized he probably got that synthesis a lot through these courses he was teaching, because he was constantly synthesizing centuries, synthesizing movements. So, for my purposes today, I use his autobiographical writings. How do I ahead? Go plus?
You just, yeah, enter.
Oh, that's all right. This is an example of one of his early writings, and this is what I'm working on now. I use Sorbello's autobiographical writings found in his unpublished work, I guess it exists only here, in this building, entitled I Start Remembering. I think it's a great, interesting title. A short beginning of a memoir that he intended for his son, Ruggero, as a way of enlightening the boy about his father's life. Now, I had to stop here because I study autobiography and I teach it, and Benjamin Franklin begins his autobiography by speaking to his son. Don't know if he picked it up from Benjamin, but Benjamin was also a cultural diplomat, so who knows? Maybe there's something there. What I find in this particular work, unfinished though it may be, is that Uguccione employs the classical thesis, antithesis, synthesis model of argument as he posits his experiences growing up, providing his readers with ways of understanding the transnational experiences that he presents. At different stages of his life, Sorbello explains what he knows and then shows how those new experiences often serve as antitheses to those earlier experiences. He then resolves this new information through a synthetic process by which he arrives at a sense of personal truth for him, and then he kind of presents it to others. So in many ways, it becomes a lesson not just for his son, but serves as a guide for anyone reading his writings about the interactions between the United States and Italy. When I spoke to Ruggiero and Antonello about his work, I asked if he had written anything like an autobiography, for I have a strong interest in the life writings of public intellectuals such as Uguccione, as I began my work in Italian-American studies more than 45 years ago by looking at autobiographies. They told me he had published some personal essays and had written the start of an autobiography. Antonella sent me 89 images, each a file, of the pages of something unpublished entitled I Start Remembering. What I want to do today is to present some observations I have made that present a very different side of this important 20th century cultural diplomat, different from what we might find in his published work, and yet it reveals that his penchant for synthesis is something that developed from his early life experiences. So he may have gotten some of the synthesis ideas of cultures from Yale, but I'm going to show that it was in his fundamental upbringing. I first tried reading this piece of writing within the context of what has become the tradition of Italian-American autobiographies, on which I've written in previous articles, and from which I have taken some basic information to provide you with a sense of what that tradition entails. I found that Sorbello's autobiographical writing was quite different from what we usually associate with the typical Italian-American tradition. And I'm going to show you how he differs from that tradition. But first, you need to know the tradition. Now, in order to know the tradition, I would need to have 25 more minutes, but we don't get that here. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of it. The writing of biographies by Italian Americans is quite a recent phenomenon in the scheme of American literary history. In 1962, Lewis Kaplan identified 28 Italian Americans who were responsible for 30 entries out of more than 6,000 written prior to 1945. Patricia K. Addis in 1983 wrote a book called Through a Woman's Eyes. She identified 14 Italian American women autobiographies, more than 2,000 American women's autobiographies published between 46 and 76. And while the number of Italian American autobiographies has increased significantly in the past 50 years, critical study of only a few of those produced during this period is limited to what I would call a handful of articles. So there's not much. There's a couple of dissertations and one book. Now, to anyone familiar with the relationship of writing to Italian American culture, what is surprising about this literature is not how few autobiographies there are, especially in comparison to the other major ethnic groups, but that any autobiographies were written at all. The small number of self-narratives can be attributed to several cultural obstacles usually found within Southern Italian culture, and I'm not going to go on and explain those today. The idea of basically omertà, not talking about the family and things like that. The idea of speaking of oneself as independent of the community, I keep forgetting to move this along, so. Oh, wait, okay. Here, this is what I'm going to get to today. The idea of speaking of oneself as independent of the community into which one was born is a recent development for Italian Americans. And this is what Gustorf has told us. He says, the conscious awareness of the singularity of each individual life is the late product of a specific civilization. Throughout most of human history, the individual does not oppose himself to others. So there's this idea of separating yourself. Now, the available literature on Italian oral traditions supports these observations. You don't tell the story of yourself in public. It's not part of any kind of cultural tradition. In fact, the early folk tales that appear in Italian and Italian immigrant culture are the folk tales of what happened to the community, or stories that were arose. Because the immigrant experience became so traumatic, people began talking about themselves. In the Italian oral tradition, the self is suppressed and not used as a subject storytelling in the communal settings where the immigrants came from. Now, despite the low priority given to writing by Italian Americans overall, many authors have emerged to document their experiences. The act of writing in any culture is a means of connecting oneself to the society that surrounds it. It's a means of bridging the public and the private. And this is what I say Uguccione does. In this aspect, we can see that Sorbello, at least through his portion, this portion that I will show you of his life writing, he follows the tradition in that he makes note of his family relationships. There's some fantastic little pieces here where he talks about taking rides in the family car and the dog riding on the fenders and on the sidebars of the car. But he does break tradition in an interesting way that we will soon see. And so the idea is that the immigrant autobiographies that were known to be written by Italian Americans, it's about remaking oneself from an Italian into an American. This we don't see. Uguccione is not about, I'm no longer Italian, I'm going to become American. What does he do? He synthesizes. You could almost make a case he's the first public Italian American, in a sense. Because you don't find the word Italian American in American publications until the late 1800s. It was by a woman, the earliest I found, I think it was 1892 by Viola Roseborough. Until then, they would write about these Italians in the United States. And the Italians who wrote would not write about themselves being American, they would write about themselves being Italian. In fact, when I grew up in the 1950s, people would ask me, what are you? I would say, I'm Italian. I go to Italy, I can't say that. They're Italian, I'm not. So when I came back, I realized I had to be something else. I should have, too bad I didn't find Uguccione's work first, I would have seen that synthesis. When reading Italian-American writers, we need to observe the ways in which traditions on both sides, American and Italian, both oral and literary, function in their narrative constructions. That I already talked about, I need somebody to just kind of push this thing along. Okay. Sorbello diverges from the norm, first perhaps because of his American mother. He never seems uncomfortable as an Italian in the United States. He doesn't go through, a lot of immigrants say they went through. In essence, he was born an Italian American, and in fact, his early cultural discomfort comes from the way he speaks Italian with a British accent. Something, as we will see, subjects him to bullying of sorts by his Italian schoolmates. In essence, Sorbello feels quite comfortable reading, writing, and speaking English, even as he warns us that he can be prone to mistakes, of which there are almost none in his memoir. He never sees himself, though, as an Italian American, and yet we can certainly read his work as the bridge between these two cultures. The act of writing, okay, I'm going to kind of skip through. I'm going to get to this, the Sorbello difference. No, when you read the article, if we publish this, you'll see the whole thing about Italian-American autobiography. What I say pretty much is that he goes against that tradition. He doesn't probably even know that tradition exists, but in retrospect, you see him, and it's incredibly different. Where does Sorbello fit into the schemata of Italian, U.S.-American literary consideration? The fact is he doesn't, or rather he presents us with ample evidence that there was another trail being blazed by Italians writing about their experiences. In the USA, one that such scholars as Anthony Tamburri, Martino Marazzi, and the late journalist translator Francesco Zerante have brought to light in numerous writings. Sorbello began his career as an Italian journalist, and as such was experienced and adept at reporting his observations from his given Italian perspective. As the French-American Hector St. John de Crecouvert did for the British, Sorbello's observations of U.S. culture synthesized what he experienced to explain Americans to the Italians and Italians to the Americans. Before I go into an example of his use of dialects to express cultural transformation, I want to present a few key scenes from I Start Remembering to demonstrate how his autobiographical writings are quite different from what we've come to expect in the Italian-American tradition. He begins I Start Remembering on the 9th of February, 1962, with an explanation of his plans for this writing. I have decided to jot down a few highlights of my life. He writes this in English. This is translated with probably some help from you, I'm sure. I did the best I could. I kept wanting to put it in my family's dialect, you know. This is essentially a manuscript for my son, Ruggero, age 9, who may be amused to read these pages in the year 2000 AD, if he and the world survive till then. I mean, there's an interesting comment there he puts in parentheses. So there's something going on. He knows that the world is about to be pushed into some area with some new things that will happen. That would be in 38 years' time. That's a quote. Sorbello is 56 years old when he begins to take stock of what has happened to me in the course of a lifetime. He mentions that he has just returned from the hospital where Ruggero has undergone an appendectomy, something he mentions his son will certainly remember and herein find the date. Do you remember that appendectomy? Okay. Thus, unlike other writers of autobiographies who are making arguments about such things as their ability to become accepted as Americans, and thus are addressing the larger U.S.-American readers, Sorbello is primarily interested in speaking to his son. He explains that he is writing in English as it becomes a world language, and that he feels he could be more candid with his thoughts and recollections. He writes, I can do this without fearing that others will pry into it. I do not mean, of course, my wife or my son. So what happens when I, a professor, pry into, 60 years later, into this work? Well, I could say that he did anticipate future readers beyond his son. In his next paragraph, and he apologizes in anticipation for their discovery of possible misspellings that might show up along the way. He says, I am also a poor speller, and that too will show up. But I haven't found a misspelling. Maybe a word that was used a little differently here. So now I am relieved of the guilt of prying into this man's life. Sorbello has come to a point in his life when he realizes that he is a witness to what has and will become history. He says, I have lived through 2 world wars, in crammed and interesting times, witnessing a good many events, which, as happens only later, did I find had been part of history. With this, he reminds us that history is created retrospectively, but he is not, as in his many other writings, concerned with narrating and explicating those key events. In these pages, quote, he says, quote, "It will be the everyday happenings, the personal remarks, the references to object and ways of doing things that now seem of no import, which will give these pages, if preserved for even 1 century, their flavor." One of the first objects he presents, he gives a little meditation on the lira, discussing its value and how it's changed over the years. Once, he says, a 5 lira piece was the smallest coin in circulation and was so light it could float on olive oil. I tried. There's no other coins that can float on olive oil except for that, but he was right. You have to, as a scientist, you have to, recreate the experiment to validate its existence, right? He provides glimpses of his early family life in Perugia and a survey of his early education in Montessori school, private tutors, which was regularly interrupted by family travels, which they often took in a car. I can't remember if I have a picture of the car. Do I have I cannot. There is a picture of the car.
Yeah, you showed that earlier.
Oh, I did. Okay, they were in the car. I should have pointed that out. And later he discusses his experiences with hats. Remember when men used to wear hats? And their relationship to the manners of men in the presence of women, especially in the elevators of the United States as an elevator operator, which he says is, quote, sacred to the hat removing rite. It's a scene right out of one of the Marx Brothers movies that he's writing, because he gets into, he's wearing his hat, he gets into the hat in an American elevator, and the men are wearing their hats. A woman comes in, and all the men take off the hat. He doesn't take off the hat because he doesn't know that tradition. And then when the woman gets out, they put the hat back on. And he said, "This is crazy. This is." And so he demonstrates that different cultures carry different manners, even in terms of fashion. A key insight into this early section of the work is his take on language. While he was Italian, he had no idea that he spoke the language with an English accent, something he learned when he was in school and was teased by his schoolmates. So he had to learn, quote, to speak Italian without the English slur of the R's and blended vowels. It appears these first 35 pages of his remembering was written in one sitting. I'm pretty sure he just wrote, because the next time we see a date above what was written was December 26, 1962. And this is where this comes in. A strong sense of history begins in this second section, in which he talks about travels to the U.S. Because of eye problems, he's advised to take a rest and accompanies his grandmother, Robert, to the U.S., to the United States. Now, she, as a young girl, he recounts, saw the 49ers leaving for the West in covered wagons. And while she was in Paris with her husband, Howell Robert, watched Napoleon II drive daily down the Champs-Élysées. She had crossed the ocean 49 times, seasick every trip, and he goes into this incredible story about her. Now, he's 16 at this point, and he, quote, fell in love with one of the girls on the ship, with whom he wins a mixed doubles tennis tournament. He's the first in his circle of friends to go to America, a rare trip unless you were doing business or traveling with family, he writes. Now, I couldn't help but realize that he's coming to the United States at the same time my grandfather is headed to the United States, in a different area of the ship, I can guarantee you that. Probably not on the same ship. But once his ship docks in Hoboken, New Jersey, not very far away from where the author Pietro di Donato was born, Uguccione is taken to the Wagstaff's home at 131st East 61st Street in New York City, and recounts his friendships with Oliver and Molly, the Wagstaff's children. Mrs. Wagstaff, who was quite a character, as her friend Miss Lucy Howe Toe, I guess I called her Toe, T-O-W-E. From the talk of the family, he moves to his impressions of New York. And he writes, New York was a wondrous town to my eyes of 16. Its buildings were already so much taller than any I knew in Europe. And I don't mean the skyscrapers, but just ordinary apartment buildings which border Lower Park Avenue. Even at the time, the city gave me the feeling of infinity, which it still does. During his first stay at the U.S., Uguccione attends a party that is an annual benefit entitled Spring in Paris, where he is given a part in a little show. He plays a Parisian reveler. He is asked to act drunk and becomes the hit of the show. He writes, so this is his first kind of public performance. Maybe this is where he gets his theater sense from. A mighty roar spread and grew in the upper darkness about me. It ended in a ripple and then a thunder of another sort of crackling noise. I realized that it was laughter followed by applause. 10,000 people were applauding me. It was a heady experience at 16. It has never happened to me in these vast proportions ever again. Now, I recount this scene because, as he writes, it becomes a primal scene for his encounter with an audience reaction to his presence. And because of this, the director seeks him out as where's that English gentleman that was such a hit out there? And he tries to get him to do more work. Once Sorbello was taken for being British, he says, I had not realized that my pronunciation, which I had learned from our nanny, Miss Weatherhead, marked me as an Englishman in America. And there's a great song by Sting, I'm an Englishman in America. I don't know if you know that song. In New York, yeah. This enables him to bypass much of that early discrimination that many Italian immigrants had encountered. Now, his social status, of course, combined with his command of the English language, allow him unrestricted entry into places different from other immigrants would not be able to. Now, this to me is the example of his first major personal synthesis, and this is what I'm going to kind of end with. But what follows, I think, is an important experience, which I suggest represents his abilities as a synthesizer. When I use the word synthesizer, other friends who have read this said it's a machine, so we'll call him a synthesist. He's taken to see the old family home in Morristown, New Jersey that his grandmother had recently sold. And he writes, a gentleman came out to meet us when he saw us poking around. He introduced himself as Mr. Cohen or Levy or some such Jewish name and told us he was the new owner. My grandmother, she was over 80 at the time, remained quite speechless. Afterwards, she told me that the year before, this same Jew had wired, offering, I think it was $25,000 for the house. The dollar was worth 3 times more than what it is today, he says. But in all her relations in Morristown, had wired her and begging her to, quote, not to spoil the neighborhood by selling to a Jew. So she had turned down the very good offer. Later, she had to sell it for $17,000. Of course, it was the same Jew who had bought it through an intermediary. I had had little experience with the anti-Jewish feelings then rampant in all American communities. We had nothing like that in Europe. Indeed, I remember that one of my mother's friends when we were children was the Baroness Franchetti, who lived at the Montesca above Città di Castello. Is that? She was a Rothschild from Paris and the earliest, quote, discoverer of Maria Montessori. His brothers John and her were quote, he's talking about him, were of course used as guinea pigs and were left for hours to play on the terrace with all the other newfangled material in Maria Montessori's school. And he ended up being photographed in the first edition of Montessori's book, which came out in London in 1910. And he writes, the fact The fact was that the anti-Jewish prejudices of my grandmother's relations in Morristown cost her $8,000, which would be about $24,000 today, nearly, and God knows how much by the time somebody reads these notes. And I did the, I figured I better tell him how much, $143,000. When he asked his grandmother why she hadn't sold it to the man for his original asking price, she answered that she couldn't possibly, quote, have done such a thing to cousin Anna and cousin Henry. I asked why in that case had not they made a higher bid on their own. But she continued to rant against the despicable trick played by Mr. Levy, as if it was not perfectly human of him to have got someone else to buy the house for him. I think the key word he uses is he finds the humanity in this experience as opposed to the Jewishness in this experience. Seeing that she would not sell it directly, he found an intermediary. Quote, I noticed that both dear cousin Henry and dear cousin Anna's houses were several blocks away and not even on the same street. Also that the dear cousins, while sympathizing with my grandmother, still seemed to hold her responsible for, quote, having allowed a Jew to settle in the neighborhood. It was all an eye-opener on the curious reasonings of prejudice. And although I was told, quote, that you must have lived in the U.S. to understand these things, all I really understood was that my grandmother had been done out of $8,000 to $9,000 by her dear cousins, and that instead of blaming it on them, or better, instead of blowing it on them, or better, blaming it on them, or better, or herself for having been so soft-hearted as to listening to them and their prejudices and blaming Mr. Levy. From that day, I think I developed a kind of liking, or at least an admiration for Jews. Now, to me, there's the synthesis. He comes in, he's naive, he doesn't see it, his idea, he sees him as, the grandmother projects the antithesis of what he's experienced, and he comes up with the synthesis. One, that they're human, and two, he admires them. And this is a time he admires them, and okay. And I think this enters into some of his behaviors later in life. I think this episode is an important example of Uguccione's power of synthesizing elements of an experience to reach a higher truth than the one he was presented by others. Rather than simply absorb the prejudices he witnesses through his family behavior, he analyzes the situation and builds an early affinity with the experience of Jews that would no doubt play a big part later on in his life when, during efforts to rescue Jews in the Marche region of Italy, he risks his own life working with the Italian resistance and in fact loses a good friend when his acquaintance is killed during one of these attempts. Now, a final example, and here's his. Well, I could go on and on, but he talks about his work. He was in. I don't know if he enlisted or if they scripted him into the British military.
Yeah, he was recruited.
Oh, he was recruited.
If offered his services.
Okay.
Of course, he was recruited.
A final example of how Sorbello's memoir touches on the little things he encountered in his life that find their way into history books comes immediately after his account of witnessing his grandmother's anti-Semitism. Towards the end of the memoir, he mentions a slogan that comes across during a visit to Washington, D.C. when he encounters the 1923 Shriners Convention. The Shriners, short for the Grand Council of the Ancient Order of the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine for North America, which now you know why they call them the Shriners, you can't say all that, is an American Masonic society established in 1870. They were dedicating that convention to raising funds for a U.S. Army History Museum. True to their goal of creating fun and fellowship and connecting to the Arabic theme of their organization, they chose to announce the fundraising campaign through a now forgotten aspect of U.S. military history, the Camel Corps. Most people don't know that they tried to use camels out in the west of the United States, in Arizona and New Mexico, for military assistance and travel and to carry heavy things. And this was the time between 1870 and the end of the 19th century when the Army experimented using camels. There's this interesting slip. In the U.S. Southwest. Now here are some images that I located regarding that convention. Park your camel with Uncle Samuel was what he heard, and he just freaked out when he heard that. He said, and I bring this up only to show how Sorbello's selection for what to include in his memoir defies traditional Italian-American autobiographies and represents what the author recalls taking his attention during his youth. He offers no explanation for the banners he sees in the streets. And there's a coin there that has the same thing, Roger Samuel. They probably passed those coins out at the convention. He offers no explanation for the banners he sees in the streets and synthesizes the experience merely by chalking it up to the American penchant for sloganeering, which he's onto something, because at this time, we're at the beginning of the rise of advertising in the United States, and he picks up on this. And certainly the forthcoming propaganda machines that both the U.S. and Italy will create to produce faith in their citizenship and fear in their enemies. No doubt Sorbello would find that this early American advertising he experienced would become a worldwide phenomenon. Now this one is interesting because it has these Native Americans on a camel. There's the Washington, D.C. and the Masonic. I mean, I think this thing could be written about for about at least 2 or 3 pages. But Park Your Camel with Uncle Samuel, Washington, D.C. Sorbello was there. He was at this. His grandmother took him through through Washington, and he said, "No, I'm going to conclude now by saying, I'm still not sure just what to make of this beginning of a memoir. But I can say that reading it for me showed me a side of Uguccione, Ranieri, di Sorbello that I had not previously encountered. And I know that this memoir will no doubt inform mine and others' future readings of his works. Ultimately then, Sorbello's skills at synthesizing both cultures into something Italian-American warrants serious consideration along with those other cultural journalists such as Prezzolini and Luigi Barzini, Giovanni Scavo, and Jerry Mangione when examining the impact that Italy has on U.S. American culture. And I can tell you that the writings that he did that were not part of this, that I've encountered, certainly, as we talked about a little bit this morning, counter and present alternatives to those stereotypes. But how many people read the Italian-American Scene opposed to how many people saw Roman Holiday or any of the other major films or other developments of stereotypes of Italians? So more attention, I think, to his work would help us at least retrospectively try to understand why those stereotypes took over, and because we are not truly behind those stereotypes. Those things still continue to exist, and I think Sorbello's work, not just in his autobiography, but in his cultural writings, might be a good base to build some counter-interpretations that work today. Thank you. Okay on time? Finito. We are done. Here.
I agree with you both that, well, in my opinion, the period, few years that Uguccione spent in the United States in the 30s forged his personality and his ideas about so many things coming back to Italy. For example, when you presented the Con le donne c'è più gusto, there is a character in that, if I'm correct, that in that play, I think the father of Isolina, and he makes fun of it, and it's a fascist. And so it starts thinking of fascism in a different way, maybe. Also, when he goes to Middlebury, he meets with Michele Cantarella, Borghese. Middlebury in that period is I mean, they are all members of the Mazzini Society. So probably he started thinking about fascism in a different way, even if he was the editor of the Italian American Review that was fascist. And also he published some articles in the Connecticut papers, I don't remember, the newspaper of Connecticut about, I mean, making propaganda for fascism. But I think that in that period he started changing his idea in that sense, and also starting thinking how to, it's interesting because he didn't finish the PhD, and Prezzolini didn't finish the Liceo. So it's interesting to put them together, no? So people of a great high culture, but outside the academy. Okay, sorry, my fault.
I mean, earlier I talked about my theme, as Anthony will tell you for sure, is connecting the streets to the academy. And that's certainly something that connects me to Sorbello, because I didn't know what to expect when we were confronted with, what's this Sorbello Foundation? Anthony said, they're doing something interesting. Come and take a look with us. And I didn't know what to expect, but when I began to see that he was doing a lot of the things then that I am trying to do now, I felt, well, maybe I can learn something from this guy. So.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that I think too that it's pretty interesting. It was like a mosaic that we're trying to put together through the years, the researches and so on. So we, as I said before, we thought before that he had gone there just to work. Instead, he tried to work. He was asked to work and study at the same time, and he made his decision. He preferred working rather than, studying. He did that for time period, but then he was too busy or too interested in be active to have a life confined within the walls of academia or just following the path that regularly you would follow as a graduate student and then become a professor, and then professor stays in universities. And we know that instead he would turn, and life of course was full of surprises. First the war, the engagement with the army, and then his active practice as a diplomat and professional, we said cultural entrepreneur at some point. So that is what he was interested in. And in a way, he was teaching, but his classroom was of a wider sort. So he was not teaching within, a single room, but with, in particular, when he started the publication of the Italian Scene, the monthly bulletin, the quality of that was immediately recognized. So a journal such as Italica suggests that teachers use it in classrooms, but of course he had a wider audience for that. So I really think that digging deeply into those years helped me understand more about, we also had questions like, where did he learn about this or that? So now we know a bit more, and the more of course we dig and the more we understand about his general attitude and his didactic, in a way, pedagogic behavior, which is kind of a constant throughout his life.
Well, I think it had a great effect, because when I took the job at Stony Brook to build an Italian-American Studies program, they had one course there, that was it. And the course was called the Italian-American Scene. And at that time I said, scene? Is there just one scene? I didn't realize that they had taken the name from this publication. I'm sure they did, because they had no imagination. No, and so I kept the name because I was a new professor there and so on. I ended up changing it to scenes, plural. But the key, I think, was that they were faced with the idea that they want to embrace this Italian-American community that surrounds them with a course, but they kind of reached, and I'm sure it was somebody who was familiar with Sorbello. Absolutely, because I know that these people were. Culture.
When you, or anybody else who probably knows about this, when you become an instructor, there's no such position in British universities. You enlist for a PhD and you teach, but you don't become an instructor. So that's something on the side, but does that, I mean, what I'm thinking about, that by appointing him an instructor, they were giving him some extra load of work. The question would be, how many of graduate students are appointed instructors? You see, there's a line there, because you appoint me an instructor, you give me a salary, and so at this point, my commitment to the graduate course kinds of diminishes. This is the question I'm asking.
No, what I think is that since he had first said that he was going to live for a while and you can ask for temporary leave, they didn't want to lose him as a teacher, and so they gave him a position as instructor. And that position was announced officially as an appointment on the Yale Daily News. So what was interesting for me was to find this list of the promotions, people that are newly hired or promoted, and he was in that list. So it was a clear shift. He had entered the school as a student, and the graduate students were expected to do teaching activities, but then at that point he was not enrolled as a graduate student anymore after the first 2 years, and they wanted to keep him because he was doing a good job. So he was promoted on field, one would say, and he had gained the grades and the rank of instructor because he deserved it, probably according to the Lipari in the first place and the school as a whole, the academia there.
That's what they used to tell me sometimes in Britain. They said, "Oh, you're a very good teacher, but your writing is not." That's not true, because I used to write a lot. That's why at the end they'd have to give me a permanent job. But I mean, the idea was...
In England, they don't like to give anybody permanent jobs. They really don't.
Yeah, actually, I want to direct my comments to Ruggero and to Fred. I found the bit about anti-Semitism in Uguccione's background enlightening, and I'll share a personal experience. If you recall, Ruggero, when I first began to come to Italy, my wife, defunta, was Jewish, was a Jew. She felt a bit, you might say, alienated, or the term she would use is churched out. But we met Ruggero on the way to a book preview by an author who was talking about the rescue of Jewish refugees in Assisi and in Umbria generally. And we discovered that through Ruggero, we were able to make connections with what the remnants of the Jewish community, as well as other people interested in the history of Jews, and I found that quite valuable. So I'm wondering if your father's experience enlightened that. That's one question, and the other is whether or not that experience also may have affected his political views during the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism and so on.
I can't answer that. I mean, I could say that I could surmise that look, to be in that social class and to have the grandmother say something and to be able to say what he said about his grandmother, maybe he never said it to anybody else, but to say it there on paper so that Ruggiero would see it, to me, shows that there's some defiance going on. And I think he defied I don't know his relationship with his father. His father doesn't seem to be too happy about a lot of the things he did, but he certainly wouldn't have been happy with him fighting and working with the resistance or joining the British Army, right? No, not at all. Because he had already been a soldier. He had already done his military service to the country. So he kind of goes beyond class boundaries and class expectations to do what's right. And to me, all this ethnic stuff is, you know, the fundamental part of it is everybody's trying to say we're all human. Well, let's begin with the human and forget about all these other differences and then see what happens. And I think this is the synthesis that Sorbello came to. It's human. He always came to what was human as opposed to this is, you know, it's better to be Italian or it's better to be American or it's better to be whatever it was.
Thanks. Anyone else?
If you don't say anything, you can go.
Last chance.
Pasta.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
We have closing remarks. You're going to remark? Is that okay? Is that okay? Okay, buddy. Depressed that it's over?
What?
We have to help Antonella get over her depression that this is over. Are we going to have remarks?
Looks like we're done. Everybody seems.
Does Ruggiero want to say anything?
I think we're okay.
Two. Oh, I think